Let's talk about the situation in Bakhmut because that is where everybody is focusing their attention right now. On February 3rd, Yevgeny Prigozhin, who is the head of private military company Wagner Group, made a statement responding to a speech that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky made, declaring that Ukraine would never give up Bakhmut. Prigozhin's response to this was, please, don't give up Bakhmut. Please, I beg of you, fight to the last man, because if you don't do that, people will see you as weak. They will get rid of you as a leader, and I want you to fight to the last person. Now, Prigozhin's intent was not, of course, altruistic here. This was a mocking response. Let's fast forward to March 3rd. Hey, you're almost surrounded. Can you please just leave? Because it would just make it easier for us if you just left. You should leave, please. Realistically, the situation for Ukraine is not good in Bakhmut. We've assessed since the end of September that Russia will do everything it can to capture Bakhmut. You have PMC Wagner with a financial incentive, you have the political incentive from the Kremlin, and then you have the politics within the Russian Ministry of Defense. Valery Gerasimov was put in charge of the operation on January 11th, and he would bring to the table the first Russian success since the capture of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. That was all the way back on July 3rd, 2022. And after the capture of Lysychansk, Russia was not able to turn that operational success into a tactical or strategic victory because they had become combat destroyed as an army in the effort to capture Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. In our assessment of Severodonetsk, there are three potential trigger points where Ukraine is going to have to make a decision on whether to stay or whether to go. The first trigger point is at the Bakhmutkova River. The river divides Bakhmut roughly by 1/3 to the east, 2/3 to the west. On the east bank is the industrial districts, as well as residential neighborhoods and a few micro districts. Because the weather has gotten warmer and because we've had some rain and snow melt, the river level is going to be higher. So this is not going to be an easy obstacle to broach, particularly with the change in tactics that PMC Wagner and the Russian military are using. The tactics they're using today do not favor doing a river crossing. And we know Russia's track records on the ability to cross rivers. But we are not talking a waterway that is the width of, say, the Seversky Donetsk River that we saw between Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, which also had unfavorable banks. This is a much easier area to broach. And if and when Russian forces broach that, that's when you get into this real nasty urban fighting like we saw in Mariupol. Although in this scenario, Bakhmut isn't surrounded the way that Mariupol was. And even if the garrison within Bakhmut were to become surrounded, it would be much easier for the Ukrainian armed forces to support that garrison through airstrikes, artillery strikes, HIMARS strikes, and looking for opportunities to provide some degree of resupply. In the northeastern part of Bakhmut, Russian forces have reached all the way to the river. That's not the case in the east or the southeastern part, but Ukraine is definitely getting to a point that in our assessment, this is a trigger point they're going to have to make a decision. The second trigger point is at Ivanyivska. This is a suburb of Bakhmut that is located on the southwest corner of the city. Ukraine has done a very effective job of defending this settlement and also to the south, defending along the entire length of the Seversky Donetsk Donbass Canal. This area is very stable, and Russian forces appear to be content to have fire control over the T-504 highway, a critical ground line of communication. That's G-Lock supply line for Ukraine. That trigger point is okay. This brings us to the third one, which is Kromove. The T-506 highway is the last paved ground line of communication that's supporting Ukraine in Bakhmut. It runs from Chasiv Yar through Kromove into the city itself. Russian forces yesterday shelled a bridge. That bridge had detonation charges set up on it in case Ukraine had to retreat so that Russia couldn't use it. The artillery strike set off those charges, and that destroyed the bridge. That is not the last road in and out of Bakhmut. There are numerous dirt roads that can be used, but that's the problem. They're dirt. We're moving into mud season, into the rainy season. They're going to be very hard to continue to use. So we've covered that there are three critical points where Ukraine is going to have to make a decision on whether to stay or go. None of those have been reached. You have two of the three that are, quite frankly, in a critical state. Ukraine is reaching a point it is going to have to start making some decisions. What practical reason does Ukraine have to stay? They are fighting a belligerent that will do everything short of sea burn, chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear to take Bakhmut. Isn't it just time to go? In our assessment, we believe there are two things that are going on. First, By forcing PMC Wagner and the Russian troops to continue to grind this out in Bakhmut, Ukraine is fighting a war of attrition with the benefit of the defender's bonus. The defender's bonus is if you are attacking a place that is well defended, you're going to need to have a ratio of 3 to 7 attackers for each of the defenders to assure that you'll be able to capture that location. Attackers by default suffer heavier casualties when they attack well-defended positions, and Bakhmut has excellent defensive structures that have been set up going back to the Cold War era. This was a military city. Ukrainian forces have kept most of Russia's available combat potential bottled up at Bakhmut for 7 months now. And this has enabled Ukraine to largely create a frozen front across the rest of the theater of war. The second reason that Ukrainian forces have not withdrawn up to this point, maintaining a siege on Bakhmut is going to be far more difficult than maintaining a siege at Mariupol or at Severodonetsk. Mariupol was surrounded in depth. Ukraine had no viable way to provide artillery support, air support, or meaningful amounts of resupply. In the case of Severodonetsk, Ukrainian forces had a strong fallback point in Lysychansk. The mistake that Ukraine made, it's one of the biggest mistakes that they made in 2022, they didn't rotate out their troops. They just kept the same frontline units fighting in Severodonetsk, had them fall back to Lysychansk. And the troops were exhausted, and Ukraine started having military units refusing to fight, and that's the point that they decided to withdraw. Now, Ukraine learned from that mistake, where we're seeing this constant rotation of units in and out. They spend 7-10 days up on a front line, then they rotate back, they bring in another unit, and this is far more effective for the physical and mental well-being of those units, and it allows replacement troops to get a little time to integrate with their new unit, for those who have been on the front lines to give them an education on don't do this, don't do that, you have to unlearn this, here's this trick that you need to know, versus you just get a group of replacements sent up to the trench, you're already in the fight for your life, and you've got no way to counsel them, train them, mentor them. The problem that Russia's going to face if they have to surround Bakhmut is they're going to have to protect the northern and the southern flanks. They're going to have to hold the eastern position, and they're going to have to be able to hold the door closed on the west side, where they're going to be wedged between Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut and Ukrainian troops in Chasiv Yar, which is also very heavily defended with defenses in depth. And Prigozhin said earlier this week that he is concerned that they could end up in this Azovstal scenario, where there is a group of Ukrainian troops who are motivated, relatively well-equipped, fighting in an urban environment in a Cold War-era city with multiple bunkers to hide in and move through, and the benefit of Ukrainian fire support. The other thing that they want to avoid when you get into urban warfare, Ukraine did this in Severodonetsk, they will hug the Russian forces. This is a technique that was developed by the Soviets in World War II. Hugging is when you get as close as possible to your enemy in urban fighting. This takes away the ability for your enemy to use artillery and airstrikes because the risk becomes very high that they'll hit their own troops. And it makes for really nasty urban fighting. In our final assessment, Ukraine will eventually have to withdraw from Bakhmut. Russia will just continue to throw combat potential at that city until it is captured. The Ukrainian General Staff will withdraw from Bakhmut at the exact moment when they are satisfied that a sufficient amount of Russian combat power has been destroyed, because ultimately this is preparing for a Ukrainian offensive later in the spring. In Luhansk, there's something that's happened in Crimea, which is very interesting. The Russian Ministry of Defense last week made a decision. They withdrew some of their forces that had been placed there as part of the offensive operations that have been going on for about 7 weeks. Russia has made some gains in forests and fields and capturing some strategically important trenches, to use their language, but there have been no settlements that they have recaptured. The units that they withdrew are being sent to Vuhledar, and that's very interesting. The units that they moved in to replace them are these poorly trained, poorly equipped Mobiks. Since January 24, Russia has suffered losses that in a modern military would not get generals promoted. They would get generals relieved of duty. They've lost over 100 armored vehicles. The 155th and 140th Naval Infantry are combat destroyed and having to be reconstituted. This is why they moved some of those units out of Crimea. They want to keep that offensive going. Vuhledar is important, and Vuhledar, we've talked about this before, at least makes sense. Bakhmut doesn't make sense. Insurgents in Mariupol are reporting that they are seeing a reduction in the number of Russian troops that are moving through the city. The Russian troops that had been dispersed in the villages around Mariupol, a lot of those forces were sent to Vuhledar, and those forces are now combat destroyed. Those villages are empty. What does this tell us? There are really just two possibilities. Number one, Russia's combat losses have been so high that Gerasimov's battle plan is starting to fall apart. They're having to make decisions on where are they going to move the remaining combat power to keep offensive operations going in the areas they see that are most critical. Number two, Russia is sitting on a large reserve force, and they are planning another offensive somewhere else in Ukraine over the next few weeks. Never underestimate your enemy. We don't see any signs that Russia is setting conditions for a second offensive somewhere else outside of Bakhmut. If we base our assessment on the information that we have available to us, it appears that Russia is starting to have staffing problems. We have a very hard time believing that the battle plan set up for Vuhledar involved losing 130 plus armored vehicles and would take months to complete. The troops that are being dedicated to continue that Vuhledar offensive were supposed to be used somewhere else. Additionally, in the last 48 hours, there have been fresh videos of Russian units that have come into Ukraine. They have been separated from the Russian Ministry of Defense, and they have been signed either to the 1st Army Corps of the Donetsk People's Republic or the 2nd Army Corps of the Luhansk People's Republic. And in both cases, neither of those units that are appealing for Russian President Putin to do something were not trained for infantry. So what we're seeing is these fresh Mobic units that have gotten more training. They've gotten 8, some of them are even saying 12 weeks of training in artillery or tanks, are being told there's no artillery pieces. We have no artillery pieces left. There's no tanks. We have no tanks to give you. You're infantry now. By changing their legal status from soldiers of the Russian Ministry of Defense to, you can't see me doing the air quotes, volunteers of the LNR or DNR armies, Russia doesn't have to count their casualty numbers. Russia doesn't have to provide them veteran benefits. Russia does not have to provide them disability and medical care beyond stabilization. They don't have to pay death benefits to their families. Wait. What about Ukraine? Aren't Ukrainian soldiers dying in all of this? Don't they have some of these same issues? Ukraine is suffering terrible losses in places like Bakhmut. If we look at a place like Vuhledar, the Ukrainian losses are nowhere near what the Russian losses are. And if we look at places like Bilohorivka and Luhansk or around Crimea, it's a similar story there. In our final assessment, it appears to us that Russian losses across the theater of war are reaching a point that the Kremlin is having to make decisions that they didn't want to make back in January. Their timetable is falling behind, and time is no longer on the side. Our last segment today is about Igor Strelkov-Girkin, our favorite FSB colonel, convicted war criminal, failed Mobic, Kremlin pariah extraordinaire. Girkin was pretty emo earlier in the week, but he is back to his salty, snarky self again. There is legislation that is moving through the Russian State Duma that would further strengthen the so-called don't say war laws, which will make it harder and expand the penalties for not only criticizing the military, but extending this out to organizations like PMC Wagner. But it's okay because Girkin's got his followers back on his social media channels, and he has come up with a list of euphemisms that they could use so that they won't run afoul of the new law. And I'm just going to read them off because this is an absolutely epic list. Number 1, victorious de-escalation of the Kyiv, Chernihiv, and Sumy regions. Number 2, an amazing successful regrouping from the Kharkiv region. Number 3, a heroic, difficult decision. Number 4, alternative success in Vuhledar. Number 5, the rapid assault on Bakhmut. Number 6, this is the best one in my opinion, year-round uninterrupted progress in Marinka. Number 7, dazzling successes near Avdiivka. Number 8, promoting reasonable savings of ammunition. Number 9, historically unrepeatable ahead of schedule. Number 10, wise rejection of established red lines. Number 11, the irremovability of military officials is a guarantee of the continuous repetition of all of our successes. Number 12, growing demonstration of Russian air defense capabilities in new territories. Epic. Number 12, a stone axe is an example of well-forgotten military innovation technologies of a bright Russian future. Number 13, Shoigu, the non-plywood marshal. Number 14, the best patriot is frightened. Number 16, turbo-patriotism is our main enemy. Number 17, Moscow was on fire. Stalingrad was on fire. We can repeat this. And number 18, everything is so good that tomorrow will be even better.
That she talked about the fact that they're in touch, have been in touch since he became chancellor, and talk frequently here. This is where we begin the conversation with the ambassador. John Herbst is with us, former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, now senior director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Ambassador, it's great to have you. The story coming out of the White House today was, before anything else, don't make too much news, apparently, but also to project some unity and not let anything else interfere with that. Do these two see eye to eye when it comes to Ukraine or not?
I think their views are quite similar, although not identical.
Okay, that's an efficient answer. Have we made too much out of this being a strained relationship in the news media? We focused on tanks. We've focused on longer range missile defense systems. There have been a lot of questions about Germany's speed on this issue.
Well, point of fact, I think that both Biden and Schultz have been too timid in dealing with the Putin threat to U.S. and German security, but of course, mainly Ukraine security for this war. The items you just mentioned, longer range missiles and rockets, tanks, and for that matter, fighter planes, are all things Ukraine needs to defeat the Russians on the battlefield in Ukraine. Both Biden and Schultz have been reluctant to provide these things. There was a little bit of a fuss about tanks in January, but by and large, neither Schultz nor Biden wanted to send tanks to Ukraine. Again, a failure because they're too timid in dealing with the Russian danger. And the reason why there were some differences that emerged publicly is that the Brits forced the issue by saying they were going to send tanks, the Poles also, and others in Europe. And that embarrassed, I would say, the White House and the Chancellery in Germany. And then the Biden administration, for the first time, began to push the Germans to send the Leopards. And the Germans still insisted they would only send Leopards if we sent our tanks, the Abrams.
Yeah, right.
So so at that point in time, a difference emerged between the two. But both would have preferred not to send the tanks, which, again, would be a serious error.
They're refuting that now. Germany says we never had a mandate that you have to send Abrams tanks, but it was widely reported, to your point, that that's exactly what happened. I guess now that the tanks are in place, though, is this a chance for these two to rebuild, or is it not about that, Ambassador? Was there a relationship to begin with?
The relationship, again, has been fairly strong. I think the Biden administration, as soon as they took power, privileged the Germans at the expense of our own interests. We saw that on the Nord Stream 2 project, which, despite multiple Russian violations of commitments that we said they needed to make, we allowed that project to proceed because the Germans wanted it. It only died after the Russians launched their big invasion. So we saw a privileging of the Germans by the administration, not always to the benefit of American interests. And I think that's continued since. But again, it's continued in part because there's been a similar overly timid approach in both Berlin and Washington, again, to Moscow's aggression in Ukraine.
I think it's fascinating that you don't really draw a difference between the two. We heard from the White House. Is there?
We're a little bit less timid. A little bit less timid. Only a little bit.
Not enough to really make a point here. The White House said China was also on the agenda. They made that pretty clear ahead of the meeting. Is that the real reason why these two leaders had to get together in the same room?
I think it was important for them to meet because Germany is a very important partner for the United States and Europe. We just shouldn't privilege them as much as the White House has. Yeah. China is part of the problem because policy towards China is one where the Germans are a good bit behind the United States. You have to credit Trump for really laying out the China danger, and Biden has more or less followed the Trump lead, albeit with a little bit less toughness. Mm-hmm. And the Germans are way behind. But Biden, of course, has influence in Berlin ways that Trump did not, because Trump treated Merkel, Scholz's predecessor, with a certain amount of disregard, which was a mistake, whereas Biden treats him with great, great respect. And we've managed to move the Germans in the right direction in dealing with predatory Chinese practices, both economic and political.
Well, how about with regard to Ukraine, though, with reports that they may be considering providing, suicide drones to Russia, which would clearly be used in Ukraine. This might be something on the docket for these two to talk about. Maybe they know something, Ambassador.
We need to prepare for this, and I credit the Biden administration for having the intelligence reports on this possibility, and then threatening, warning the Chinese don't do it. I suspect the Chinese will not do it. If in fact they do it, I believe that it'll be very important for the United States and our allies and partners to put serious sanctions on the Chinese. I think the Chinese do not want to worsen relations with Washington by sending weapons to Russia, but we'll see.
We should note on Thursday, Scholz warned China not to arm Russia ahead of this meeting, expressing disappointment that Beijing was no longer willing to join in a, quote, clear condemnation of the Russian attack, unquote. We certainly saw that this week in the G20 meeting, Ambassador. How much of a problem is that?
Look, I welcome that statement. It's good that the Germans are taking a firmer line with the Chinese. And again, I would credit the White House with helping move the Germans in that direction.
Glad you could come talk to us. John Herbst, former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. Thank you, sir, for being with us. He's now with the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. In fact, he is senior director. I want to get back to what we heard from Karine Jean-Pierre today as we prepare to assemble the panel. Here's the press secretary at the White House talking about Biden, Scholz.
They first met when he became German chancellor early last year, I believe on February 7th, soon after he clearly took office, and they met here at the White House. And over the past several years, they've seen each other at the margins of the G7, at the summit in Germany, at NATO, at the G20 summit, and have talked by phone regularly. And so this is clearly a relationship that has been growing over the last year.
They're bosom buddies. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano join us, I'm happy to say, on a Friday here on Bloomberg Sound On, Bloomberg Politics contributors in our signature panel. What do you think, Rick? What's the significance of this meeting today? And was it smart to have no news conference, no real public face to this event at all?
Well, I definitely take it that it is a working visit in the sense that they don't really have an intention of making a big public harangue about it, but have things to talk about. And I think we've heard, from Ambassador Herbst about some of those topics are very important to the ongoing presence of the war in Ukraine. So it makes all sense to have that kind of a session and to follow up on the NATO conferences from last week and the visit. But I would say it is a little insulting that the Chancellor Scholz doesn't get a better reception from the Americans.
You think?
It's no fancy dinner, no big press conference, no bands. Here's a couple of candy bars and a good night. That's about all the guy's getting on this trip. So hopefully that plays back home for him, and that maybe that's part of the dynamic of German politics, to go here and work and not to play. But it does seem to be productive, and hopefully they can get on the same script. They certainly said they're on the same script. But I agree with Ambassador Herbst. I think that script needs to be more aggressive.
Yeah, well, okay, and that's another factor here, too, though. But about the communications, Jeannie, there's going to be some images of them in the Oval Office together. I'm not sure anybody cares. You couldn't even hear what they were saying on the reporters' shotgun mics in there. They're kind of looking at the floor. It's a very serious tone. If you want to project unity, why not put them out there in the East Room for a news conference?
Yeah, I mean, people were describing it as unusual, perplexing, almost low key to a point of baffling. And to Rick's point, you have the chancellor traveling with no press. We understand he's doing an interview with CNN that won't even air until Sunday. And so the big question is, of course, why? What is going on? And some of the speculation is, of course, that the chancellor came over here to tell Biden that he's got to really watch the rhetoric rhetoric that's ratcheting up in Congress and out of the administration with China, that is a real concern for Germany, and the impact could be dramatic. But of course, that is all speculation. But I would just note, look at the op-ed that Peter Baker, of all people, wrote in the New York Times the other day. There is, decreasing support across the board for the effort in Ukraine, and the ambassador made the good point. Is Biden risking under-resourcing this war to the point where it is unwinnable because it is going to drag on too long? That is a big question as we start year 2 of this thing.
What do you think of that idea, Rick? Did Olaf Scholz come here with a message for Joe Biden?
He may have. I mean, he's been a pretty stalwart supporter of the Biden plan as it relates to the Ukraine. And maybe there are issues at home that are pushing him in a different direction. Certainly, there was enormous confusion around this tank issue. and it didn't look good that the NATO forces and the United States couldn't get on the same page repeatedly. So maybe this is a session where they're just getting their messages and their actions align so that there's no more public look like there's a split in NATO. This is extremely important to Zelensky, that there's a unified Europe, unified United States backing his effort in the war, and any opening is exploited by the Russians, and were in this instance.
Rick and Jeannie are with us on a Friday. It's Bloomberg Sound On. Thanks for joining us here on Bloomberg Radio. We also got news late today from the White House that I need to ask you both about. Not so much about the impact of this, because it appears to be said and done. The president had a cancerous lesion removed. It was from his chest, and this is just being disclosed a couple of weeks after the fact here on a Friday afternoon. This is basal cell carcinoma, a common form of skin cancer. His doctor, Kevin O'Connor, issued a letter saying all cancerous tissue was successfully removed. No further treatment necessary here. Jeannie, my question for you is just the way it's rolled out. Was this the right way to do it? Do you do it after the news briefing has ended on a Friday? You kick out a letter like this? Obviously, this is not something he's going to be going into treatment for. It's a closed event, if you will. Is that well done for the White House Communications Office?
Yeah, it's good news for the president. His family, his health seems to be okay. And everything has been taken care of medically. Politically, this is obviously a fraught time for this to occur. And I think there will be questions raised as to why they waited this long to roll it out, a couple weeks. Yeah. Obviously his health is the number one thing, but this is somebody who is on the verge, we think, at least according to his wife, of declaring for a next term. And he, of course, is the oldest president we've ever had. So these are serious issues. I think that they have to really manage this very, very carefully. And I think waiting raises more questions than it's probably worth, unless there was a health reason to do it.
Rick, I know this might hit close to home for you. The president's routine physical was on February 16th. That's when the cancer was successfully removed, according to the doctor.